It's my pleasure today to talk for, I think we have 15 minutes or so, about a project that my colleague Sarah Carthy and I have been working on for the best part of the past 3 years. So as you can imagine, there's a lot that I could talk about, but I won't. So anything that's unclear, please let me know in the Q&A. And this project was made possible by the Dutch National Research Council as well as by the Canadian government. So big thanks to those two organizations. And what we've been working on, is not the royal plural, but stands for Sarah and I, is an understanding of the differences between radicalization processes that lead people to become involved in terrorist violence and radicalization processes that lack this outcome. Which really is the following research question. So what distinguishes extremists, which for us were people who cognitively very clearly embraced the notion that political violence and terrorism were necessary and were legitimate and in many cases the only option to bring about the political societal change that they saw as desirable. So all of the people in our project believed terrorism, political violence more broadly was right and was necessary, but not all of them engaged in it. So what separated those extremists who did, on the basis of these beliefs, actually engage in terrorist attacks from those who believed the very same things, were often in similar organizations and movements, but did not themselves engage in terrorist attacks. Now, I would have loved to be able to say that our project is a first of its kind endeavor and that we're only people who've looked at this so far. That's not the case. There's a small but growing literature on this very subject. I think for a long time, terrorism research has tended to treat radicalization as something of a process with one particular ending, and people become involved in terrorism. That is, of course, not the case. There's many, many ways in which people can enact their radicalized views. We've known this for some time, but only recently have people really begun to empirically look at this. So what differences, if any, can we find? So we were coming at this not as the first people to look at this problem, but as one of the few, I think, still so far. What do we do differently than existing research? So our fancily named data set, I won't go into details there, but you can see it on the slide. We do a few things that I think stand out. So first of all, we used a very large codebook. And to put it simply, that just means that for every individual that we analyze, we asked a lot of questions about them, close to 160 variables. And we tried to make sure that we weren't just coming at this from one particular angle. So we weren't only interested in what these people were like at an individual level or what they had gone through in life, for instance. We also explicitly included a range of variables that describe the broader movement or the specific extremist group to which these people were, with which these people were involved. And we also had attention for broader structural level variables. So, for instance, the political situation in the countries in which these individuals lived and radicalized. Another element that I think allows us to stand out at least a bit is that we complemented a pervasive attention for risk factors with protective ones as well. So in the terrorism literature, it's very common to find assessments of the particularly individual level risk factors that brought someone to commit an act of terrorism. And we're often very good at retroactively piecing together when someone has committed an attack, where it went wrong, right? So at which points in life their radicalization increased and where they took the turn to actually turning their views into violent praxis. But what we don't tend to do so much yet is look at the flip side of this coin. What are protective factors? What might be elements, influences, that keep people who share these grossly violent worldviews from actually acting upon them? There is, of course, some attention to this, but I think there's a lot to be gained from a closer look. We also put an emphasis on primary data collection, which is why it took us, I think, close to 2 years just to do data collection, which means we tried to interview as many of these extremists and terrorists as possible. We relied on information that we were able to draw from government agencies, particularly the Dutch Public Prosecution Service. All of that to say, we tried to get a very detailed, close-up, first-hand look rather than rely solely on what others or media had written about these individuals and events. And to avoid making our work very specific on one particular national context, we sought out a range of cases from European and North American countries, the latter being, of course, the US and Canada, the European being Scandinavian countries, the Netherlands, France, Belgium, UK, Germany, among others. So I want to give you just a bit of background before I delve into the results, and hopefully you forgive me for doing this just before lunch. So how do we go about doing this? We first drew up a code book, essentially all the questions that we wanted to ask of the people in our data set. We didn't think of these questions all by ourselves, but instead we relied on a rather broad-ranging literature review. What have others in our field and adjacent fields thought of as relevant for understanding not just why some people might turn to terrorism, but also why people who are radicalized and share these violent views ultimately don't? So we incorporated that into the questions that we were asking. Important to know before I turn to the results, I think on the next slide, is, okay, so who were we actually asking these questions of? What were the individuals in our data set? Our case selection was limited only to homegrown extremists, so to say. So individuals with strong ties of belonging to the countries in which they radicalized and in which some of them committed terrorist acts. What this means is we didn't look at foreign fighters, so no individuals who traveled, for instance, to Syria and Iraq to join groups like ISIS. We did this for a variety of reasons, one of them being that we think that insurgent warfare and terrorism with groups like ISIS in the Middle East is qualitatively different from extremism and terrorism as it might occur in a country like the Netherlands or Germany. So we didn't want to compare apples and oranges. More practically, it's often very, very difficult to find reliable and detailed information on what individuals in countries like Iraq and Syria did when they joined groups like ISIS. So this project really is only about people who radicalized and did or did not commit terrorism in places like Germany, the Netherlands, etc. Another important thing to note before going to these results is that we relied on an academic definition of terrorism and extremism, which I won't go into now for the sake of time, rather than criminal law statutes. And we did this to kind of impute some uniformity in our case selection, although because countries vary in what they see as terrorism and not. What this does mean, however, is that in some of our controls, so in the radicalized individuals who didn't engage in terrorist attacks, you will find individuals who've been convicted of terrorism-related offenses. Now, this might be a bit confusing, but it's important to know that terrorism-related offenses can cover quite a broad range of activities, such as fundraising, logistical support, recruitment, membership of prescribed organizations, etc. And our prime interest here really was in, did these radicalized individuals engage in terrorist attacks, or did they not? So our controls, those who didn't engage in terrorist attacks, just to be very clear, doesn't mean they didn't engage in a whole range of other, often very illegal activities. But we were really interested in this primary distinction between terrorist violence or not. Excuse me. At the end of our data collection period, we had a data set of some 206 individuals, and it was split right down the middle. So 103 had become involved in terrorist attacks, 103 had not. 103 were right-wing extremists, and 103 were jihadist extremists. And we wanted to include both ideologies, as we saw both of these likely to form the prime kind of extremist terrorist threats to European and North American nations moving forward. You can tell that we have, sorry, I'm coming at you with a bit of a cold here, so forgive me for that. You can tell that most of our sample is from Europe. Our median year of birth was 1980, so I think we're talking about at least relatively young individuals, so hopefully our project will have some relevance for how extremism develops moving forward. Enough talk about backgrounds. Now I'm presenting you with a lovely table, but don't worry. This table was drawn up by my fantastic colleague Sarah, who has great skills in statistics, which I lack. So I will be talking you through this much closer to my own training as a historian. What you're seeing here is kind of the outcome of a regression analysis, which tells us out of all of those close to 160 variables, those questions that we asked of our sample, which, what number is this, 8 or 10, are the most relevant in combination with one another. And I've added some color to help you distinguish between risk and protective factors. So what we're seeing here are the variables that, according to us, have the largest influence on whether someone who radicalizes is likely to engage in terrorist violence or not. Of course, this is all correlation, so none of these things make it certain that someone will engage in terrorism or not, but they help us understand why people do not engage in this form of political violence. So maybe just talk you through a couple of really not so surprising ones first. So among the risk factors, we see criminal antecedents, access to weapons, being male, and having adverse childhood experiences as risk factors, increasing the likelihood that radicalization will lead to terrorism. This is well supported in a broader literature. In the green for protective factors, we also see a couple of things that we already know about and that our work kind of adds to. So having a relationship during radicalization, in particular parenting children, it leaves you with no time, as parents will know for anything else. Having a greater self-control, these things tend to make it less likely that people who radicalize will turn to this form of violence. For the sake of time, I just want to kind of delve into a little bit more detail into probably the most surprising finding here, which is right in the middle there, in green, that participation in an extremist group acts as a protective factor. So when we found this, we thought, okay, great, we've wasted lots of funders' money, 2 years of data collection, because this can't be right. But then we delved into it a little bit more deeply, and we think it does make at least some sense. Because when we think of extremist groups, terrorist organizations, names like Al-Qaeda, Red Army faction, ISIS, those tend to pop up, IRA. The most violent, most well-known exponents of extremist groups. But in fact, most even extremist groups are not so keen to engage in the terrorism that their ideologies prescribe, because they know that the state has become, in most countries, a very, very powerful adversary. And the most likely consequence of engaging in terrorism in a country like ours here, as a group, is that you'll be in prison for a very long time or you'll be dead. And extremists, even though they have this often fanatical belief system, they also tend to be quite keen not to be dead or in prison. So what we found is that many of these extremist groups actually somewhat dampen the likelihood that their members as a group will engage in this form of violence. And this matches broader trends that we've been seeing. I mean, in the 1990s in the US, for instance, we see very explicitly this rise of something called leaderless resistance, as opposed to engaging in violence in cells or in groups, in recognition of the fact that the state has become so powerful that engaging in terrorism as a group tends to be ineffective. And groups like IS have similarly advocated for members to engage in violence by themselves, make it as simple as they can to evade detection and arrest by security services. Now, participation in extremist group, would that then translate into a policy recommendation that if you want to prevent terrorism, maybe we should let these groups persist? I'm putting it maybe a bit jokingly, but it's a very tough question that I'm glad I don't really have to answer. Because in one sense, yes, if you can, there's a sense that if people can kind of share their grievances and share their often very horribly violent ideals with one another, perhaps that's sufficient for most of them and they won't actually engage in the violence that they seem to be believing in. It becomes more difficult when these groups aren't just fringe movements, but have a much larger, or the potential for a much larger popular following. Because by allowing these groups to persist, you might be preventing terrorism in the short run, but what are you contributing to in the longer run? So there's some real issues to consider in this sense. But I think I see Greg looking at his watch, so I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there for now. But yeah, the notion about groups being a potential impediment, a protective factor to engaging in terrorist violence was the main thing I wanted to share. So thank you for that, and I look forward to any questions you may have.